Welcome to the Bearded Nerd Podcast. As a game master, we have all been there. Your players zig when you thought they'd zag, and suddenly you're left scrambling to keep the session moving. Improv is one of the most valuable skills a GM can have, but it can also be one of the most intimidating. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to build confidence in your improv abilities, practical tools you can use to prepare for the unexpected, and tips for creating an engaging on-the-fly moment that makes your players feel like it was planned all along. So without further ado, let's dive in. Many that are new to being a game master or even new to the hobby may ask themselves why improv is so important. In my opinion, improv is really important because it keeps the game moving and flowing when the players deviate from your plans. For example, when you've planned the session to be a mostly role-play based session, pushing the narrative forward, but then your players choose to get hung up on one particular NPC, which may or may not cause a random combat encounter. Yeah, sure, maybe you had the stats of this NPC ready available. Maybe you're really good at Googling random stats or even using ChatGPT to pop up or to produce some stats on the fly. But it still wasn't part of your plan. So by learning to improv, you're able to keep the game flowing and keep the story going flawlessly. And to mention, part of that flawless feeling makes the world feel dynamic and alive. Everything just keeps moving and flowing in a Zen-like way. It makes the world real because, as we know, all of us here on Earth tend to improvise life a couple of times. So this is just what it is. It is life. We go through it. We go through that motion in a beautiful way. And with storytelling games, when you're able to improv, you're able to replicate that feeling. You're able to replicate that dynamic nature and make that world alive and immerse your players in the world. Lastly, and I think this is one that's been overlooked many a times, by being able to improv, it builds trust between you and your players. They, your players, know you as the GM can adapt to their choices. Now, mind you, we hope that your players don't abuse of this often, but the players know that they can throw zingers at you and you're able to dodge them, weave them, or even throw it right back at them, which again makes the players trust you more. And then it builds upon the aspect that the world is real and keeps the game flowing. Now, I'm not trying to say anything from my high horse because there are a lot of challenges that come up as a game master. In my opinion, game masters have a couple of challenges, 3 to be exact. The first one is the feeling of being caught off guard when players go off script. The second is the challenge of creating an engaging NPC or dialogue on the spot. And then the third is the gap filling, right? When we have to fill the gaps in the world without feeling able to, so to speak, because of the pressure, or more importantly, filling in the gaps in the world without it feeling hollow or forced. So sometimes we prep for a particular encounter. Let's say it's a role-play encounter, and it's with this NPC, this one NPC. We made a script, we did all these cool things, we prepped and planned for that session, and it was awesome. But then your players go to this other NPC and you have nothing prepared. So that feeling of, oh no, I'm in danger, so to speak, is a little bit off guard, and it puts you in a place of panic. In my opinion, that type of engagement with the NPC and with the players could be a little bit challenging. And especially when you have to create an NPC that is on the spot, right? That's where we get the name Boblin the Goblin or something of that nature, where it's like, oh, this is Thranduil of the Woodland Realm. Well, GM, I don't want to talk to them. I want to talk to this guy. Oh, that's Bob, ... It kind of just feels awkward and it feels weird, or rather, it can feel awkward. And again, sometimes it feels forced when you're like, oh, this is ... Bob, right? It feels forced or hollow. So we want to avoid that. And although it is a challenge and it's something that we could validate as being true and authentic, at least from a emotional feeling perspective, we should be able to build from there and build our improv skills. So this is how I would recommend it. But first, a word from our sponsor. Today's episode of the Bearded Nerd podcast is brought to you by Dungeon Soap, a must-have for every adventurer who wants to keep clean while slaying dragons. Dungeon Soap is handmade TTRPG-inspired soap crafted for gamers. Whether you're a knight, rogue, or wizard, it is for you. Each soap is uniquely themed to bring a little magic to your daily routine, and it's made with quality ingredients that are gentle on your skin. So even after a long day in the dungeon, your skin will feel great. Right now, listeners of the Bearded Nerd podcast can get 10% off their order. Just head over to dungeonsoap.com and use the discount code BEARDED10 with a capital B at checkout. So whether you're prepping for your next session or just looking to freshen up after a dungeon crawl, Dungeon Soap has you covered. Check it out and bring a little fantasy into your daily ritual. That's dungeonsoap.com. And don't forget to use Bearded10 to save 10%. So how do we start building confidence in our improv skill? Well, first and foremost, start small. Practice some small improv scenarios outside of your main game, like creating a random NPC or responding to hypothetical player actions. You can do this during a one-shot for your players during game night or a one-shot at your LGS. I personally recommend the latter because you don't know those people and it will really kind of baptize you in fire, so to speak, where you're having to randomize or rather improv on random events. I would even create for this a list of random NPCs with their personalities, things like that. Again, I always recommend roll tables or those random roll tables where you can just kind of look at the name, look at their personality description, whatever is on the table, and go from there. You can even write a little post-it note next to it that maybe talks about their accent or showcases a little quirk or something like that. Whatever it may be, whatever helps you. But again, start small. Improv small little scenes outside your game, a little one shot even, whatever. Run a one shot and improv most of it. Don't plan, right? 5 to 10 notes of what's going to go on. Obviously, you might not want to improv combat if you so choose to include it, but role play those little things and just think how that character would act. But the second thing, and again, this is a little bit more philosophical, it is trusting the process. Accept that not every decision has to be perfect. Just focus on keeping the story moving. You may not want the players to go to that random NPC and pick a fight with them because you had planned for the party to engage with an NPC within the tavern that is supposed to reveal lore and the next steps in the story and so on and so forth. But your players chose another direction. So, one, you won't get as mad or frustrated if you accept it. But two, you learn to deal with it better when you focus on saying to yourself, okay, let's keep the story moving. Here's another cool thing that you can do when trusting the process and when just kind of focusing on the story itself. All that information you had on the NPC that they were supposed to talk to, you can literally copy and paste, plug and play, drag and drop, whatever the term you enjoy, into the NPC that has the player's interest at the moment. That NPC they're going to pick a fight with, right? In our hypothetical situation, just take all the information that you have from the NPC that you were going to run, mainly, let's just say, for lack of better words, and plug it all into the NPC they are choosing to run with or to play with, interact with, whatever it may be. It not only keeps the game flowing, but your ability to shift makes the players think, ooh, this person had this plan. The GM had it planned. And it keeps the game, like I said, flowing, but it makes your world feel alive. Lastly, focus on the players. Use their actions and questions to guide the direction of your improv. Let's say the GMs, you as the GM rather, are running your session and your player begins to ask, well, what is the local economy like, right? Something that maybe you didn't plan for. Well, let's be honest. No one really plans for a question like that. But you run with the question. All right, roll a history check, especially if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons. But, have them roll whatever type of history or lore check that would really see if they know the history of, or if their character rather, would know the history of the economy and whatnot. And then what you can do is say, well, you can make it up. You can make up whatever you want, depending on their role. If it's really good, then you can say, oh yeah, it's the standard economy that does this, and that, and go from there. Or if they roll low, you can just say, hey, you don't know it. Sorry, you don't. You're not from here. Or rather, make it really interesting. Hey, you're just noticing strange little coins and tidbits in a bartering system that doesn't really apply to what you're used to. Again, I'm improvising here, but you could basically say whatever you want, but just roll with it, right? Just roll with it and focus on the players. What's the question that they're trying to ask, right? And get to the root of it. It's okay as the GM for you to say, hey, what are you trying to inquire, just so that I know, right? They may say, oh, well, they may have their own particular reasoning, right? They may want to barter something, or they may want to just get rid of the gold that they have. And then you can go from there. I have in my head, and maybe it's because I've been doing this for a while, so I apologize, but in my head, if a player asked a random question like that, I would personally say, what is the intention behind that? Oh, your intention is to see if you can offload some of this gold because you don't want to be carrying this kind of funny money. I don't know, something like that. And then I would say, well, you can, but the thing is that these people in this town typically barter for goods. They don't have use or any usage for this, coin, and go from there, right? I can kind of improv it depending on the scenario. And again, this whole couple of minutes of this podcast that I have just been talking about, the local economy, that's all improv too. That is not scripted. So again, the reason I'm able to improv, I've done it for a bit, but I focused on you, the audience. And in this case, in your case, you can focus on your player. Now, with all that being said, I do believe that there are practical tools for you as a game master and even as a player to utilize for your improv. Random generators, random roll tables, that branch of randomness is highly recommended. It's great for name generators, right? Don John's a good one. I think there is Epic Fantasy Name Generator. I know there's Fantasy Name Generator, period. That's a website. But name generators are great for that. Encounter or dungeon generators for quick challenges. You can go online. Honestly, whether you agree or not, you could utilize ChatGPT for an encounter generator or a dungeon generator. You can go on various websites that utilize this. You can utilize plot twist generators, and that really adds an unexpected notion or some extra spice, so to speak, in your game. I also recommend the yes and technique. You've heard it multiple times, but it builds the player's suggestions into your storytelling. So rather than shutting them down, you're able to basically incorporate that suggestion into your narrative. So for example, if the player asks, "Does this town have a blacksmith?" you could respond with, "Yes, and he's known for crafting weapons for the royal guard." So it's not necessarily a no, that person is not available to you. So I haven't prepared deep down inside, so don't ask that question, right? It's not saying that. It's saying, yeah, there is a smith here, but he's known for crafting weapons for the royal guard. So if you want a weapon, you can inquire and see, and then kind of come up with a cool role play experience from there and just let it take over. But the yes and technique is something that I really like to do for improv. Now, some great content creators and YouTubers, I believe Ginny D has spoken about this before, have a philosophy or have a notion that the yes and technique should be limited. And I can't remember the video specifically, but I do agree with Ginny D. The yes and technique's really good for improv, but don't let it overtake your life as a GM, right? You don't want your players to say, "Oh, can I have a pet dragon?" Yes, ... And the dragon is, you don't want that, right? Because that could kind of throw some balance off in the world. This is just more from an improv perspective. When players ask certain questions that are logical and reasonable, use the yes and technique. Lastly, I highly recommend reusing content. Repurposed unused ideas, maps, NPCs from previous sessions, right? What I spoke about earlier, the NPC Joe that the players were going to roll, that you had planned to have role play and discuss and talk and do all that good stuff. But now they're fighting Dan. Well, take all the information that you had from Joe and put it on Dan and go from there. That way, feels real. Another thing I would say is create a pool of versatile NPCs with just basic personalities, basic motivations, basic descriptions. Just have a list of them. Just boom, right there. Random list, and go from there. You can make it into a roll table format, or you can quite literally just have one note or a Word document, whatever it may be, with all these different NPCs. That has really helped me in my improv skills, and I highly recommend it. Now, techniques that you can use on the fly for role play. I got 3 of them. 1, quick NPCs, as I like to say. It's a simple formula. Their name, a quirk, and a motivation. So for example, Dara, a chatty innkeeper who secretly collects rare coins. Boom. Pretty much it. That's what you use. What I mentioned earlier about the pool of versatile NPCs. Well, this is your formula. Like I said, Dara, chatty innkeeper, secretly collects rare coins. Joe, mysterious, or rather, I should say, introverted herbalist who secretly wants to share their novella. Something like that, right? Just whatever it may be, but have something really simple. And it allows you to create NPCs quickly and on the fly. Second, stick to archetypes. Use familiar character tropes as placeholders. The gruff mercenary, the naive villager, yada, yada, yada. Things like that. Just keep it simple. And then lastly, pace yourself. Pause for a moment. Gather your thoughts. It's okay to say, "Hey, give me a second to think about that." You can tell your players that. You don't have to be Matt Mercer. That's the whole Matt Mercer effect, that Matt Mercer himself would probably hate that y'all are putting that pressure on yourself. And for those who are new to being a game master, that's a whole different topic, but give yourself some grace. Just give yourself some grace and allow yourself to breathe for a minute. And it's okay to tell your players, "Hey, just give me a second. Let me look at my notes." Now, if you don't know the answer, or rather you want to kind of leave it mysterious, but more importantly, you don't know the answer, it's okay to fill in the gaps, right? This is the filling gaps section that I recommend you keep it simple. Everything here in this episode is about keeping it simple. So what I recommend is when you don't know, leave it vague, right? Keep it vague and expand upon it later. A great example is, hey, the merchant's goods seem strange, exotic fabrics, peculiar spices. Something about them feels off. And you, as your character, feel like it's best to just keep an eye on that until later, right? You kind of tell them without telling them, hey, let's put a pause to this. You give them an answer, enough for the character to kind of chew over and the player, and it buys you a little bit of time. The next thing you can do is redirect questions. So when the player asks about a particular ruin, you can turn around and say, well, what do you think the ruin looks like? What does your character think? And then have that thrown back. And again, it's a lesson on improv. It's a good way to kind of throw things back and keep it flowing. Now, to take this all and to kind of meld it together, because a lot of questions may come from combat. How do you run improv or combat on the fly? Use pre-made stats for generic enemies. Oh, a mercenary? Pre-made stats. An owlbear? Pre-made stats. A random bear, whatever. Maybe you have to tweak on the spot, like hit points or attack bonuses, but just have generic stuff. Oh, bandits, ruffians at the tavern, bandit NPC stats, whatever it may be, right? Just keep it simple. Use pre-made as much as you can. Remember how I talked about, copying, pasting certain stats? This is one of those times to do that, right? The interactions, though, that may come out of maybe combat or an improv scene, well, let the player shape that dialogue. Let the player shape that scene. Use their cues to guide your reactions as the NPC generator, so to speak, right? As the GM, you're generating all these NPCs. Well, if a player has a particular cue that they're dropping, go from that, pursue that cue, and see what happens. Lastly, there are environmental details that we should be aware of, right? Focus on one or two sensory details to quickly describe a new location. You know how I always preach about the 5 senses, right? It is sight, sound, sight, sound, taste, all that, right? All those senses, just like the 5 W's. I don't know what it is about me and the number 5, but I like it, and this has worked for me. So for you, when you're trying to improv a scene, quickly and, effectively pick 1 or 2 sensory details and go from there. That helps you describe a location or a person, right? An example, the forest smells damp. The air buzzes with the sound of insects. Or let's say Dara, we were using that example earlier. Dara is a very loud individual that has a nasally type of inflection in their voice. But when stepping closer to them, they have a peculiar perfume that smells of roses and smells of lavender, right? So you can add those aspects to it, or you can say, yeah, Dara, although her voice is nasally, when turning around and addressing her customers, she appears to have a confidence like no other, hands on the hip, blah, 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 whatever it may be. Use those aspects to improve your improv and to help you talk about certain details and depict scenes randomly. Again, this is all going off the fact that this is on the fly. Now, here are some practical tips that I have used to help build my improv skills. Number 1, play improv games. Try games and exercises like 20 questions with your friends, or any sort of collaborative storytelling practice that makes you think on your feet. Maybe you're on a car ride with your friends and play 20 questions. Play it with your D&D group, whatever it may be. But play games like that on your game nights that are maybe not D&D centric, but are improv based, and that will help. The second is write down hooks. Keep a list of ideas for NPCs, encounters, or plot twists that you can pull out as needed. I have always been a huge fan of the deck of stories. Critical Dice came out with that in a Kickstarter. I actually have the original deck and the Kickstarter version. But if you can find it, purchase the deck of stories and utilize that. It has the orc system that allows you to basically create an adventure hook and then have it ready for your players. It's a great tool. I highly recommend it. Lastly, collaborate with your players. Use their creativity to fill in details in the world. It lessens your burden. Allow them to co-world build and go from there. That allows you to stay consistent. Because again, making up details on the spot, it can be jarring, but when you write them down, when you have all that information there, that actually helps you with the collaboration perspective in the improv aspect. But here's actually another thing that I thought about regarding jotting down details on the spot. If you make up something on the spot after your session, I just thought about this, write it down. Write it down because that will help you maintain consistency and allows you to remember so that you're not having to recreate the wheel or reinvent the wheel with NPCs. You can just kind of list this all down and then, whether you use it for the same NPC or whether you take that information for another NPC, kind of like the tip that I mentioned earlier about recycling content, you have it either way. And that's a wrap on today's episode. Improv can seem daunting, but with a little practice and the right tools, it can become one of your greatest strengths as a GM. Remember, your players don't need perfection. They just need you to keep the story alive. Whether it's using random generators, leaning into player creativity, or reusing old ideas, there are so many ways to improv with confidence. Thanks for tuning in to the Bearded Nerd Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, share this episode, and check out Dungeon Soap with code BEARDED10 for 10% off. Much love, and as always, keep gaming.